The Jewish question still exists. It would be foolish to deny it. It is a remnant of the Middle Ages, which civilized nations do not even yet seem to be able to shake off, try as they will. Attacks in parliaments, in assemblies, in the press, in the pulpit, in the street, become daily more numerous. In countries where we have lived for centuries, we are still cried down as strangers. Oppression and persecution cannot exterminate us. No nation on earth has survived such struggles and sufferings as we have gone through. Distress binds us together, and thus united, we suddenly discover our strength. Yes, we are strong enough to form a state, and indeed, a model state. We possess all human and material resources necessary for the purpose. The idea which I have developed in this pamphlet is a very old one. It is the restoration of the Jewish state. The world resounds with outcries against the Jews, and these outcries have awakened the slumbering idea.
These words were written in 1895, almost 120 years ago. They were part of a pamphlet entitled Der Judenstaat, or The Jewish State. The author was a 36-year-old Viennese journalist and playwright named Theodor Herzl. In 1895, what Theodor Herzl was proposing seemed, even to his supporters, an impossible goal. But to all who insisted it was a fantasy, Theodor Herzl had this to say: "If you will it, it is no dream."
Herzl was the first name that I can remember as the king of the Jews. I mean, he was a king without a kingdom and a prince without a people. But he touched the most important thing in Jewish life, and this is faith, spirit, dreams, legend. And it's an unbelievable story.
In 1894, Theodor Herzl was living in Paris and working as the bureau chief for Vienna's Neue Freie Presse, one of Europe's most respected newspapers. At the moment, the big story making headlines was the criminal trial of Captain Alfred Dreyfus, who'd been arrested on a charge of high treason for selling military secrets to the Germans. Dreyfus, who came from a prominent Jewish family that had been living in France for generations, insisted he was innocent. His supporters maintained that he had been framed by a group of anti-Semitic officers. In the days following Dreyfus's arrest, Theodor Herzl, like much of the French public, believed that he was guilty.
The evidence indicates that Dreyfus has really committed the ignominious act.
But as the military trial unfolded at the École Militaire in Paris throughout December 1894, Herzl's opinion about Dreyfus's guilt began to change. He became completely convinced that Dreyfus was innocent and was being unfairly prosecuted because he was Jewish. Despite the fact that in 1791, France became the first country in the world to emancipate its Jewish population, anti-Semitism was surging among the French in the years leading up to the Dreyfus case. In fact, anti-Semitic violence had been spreading throughout Europe, starting in the 1870s in Germany and Austria. Then, hundreds of Jews were killed in pogroms in Russia and the Ukraine. The situation began turning against French Jews in 1882 with the collapse of the Union Générale, a Catholic bank founded with the blessings of Pope Leo XIII. The faithful had invested heavily in Union Générale. Both the aristocracy and the middle class had their money in the bank upon the advice of their priests. When the Union Générale collapsed in the 1882 stock market crash, rich and poor French Catholics were economically devastated. And the Jews were blamed for it all when rival banks, including the House of Rothschild, came through the crash relatively unscathed. Edouard Drumont, an unknown writer, soon made his reputation on a 2-volume book entitled La France Juive, or Jewish France. An immediate bestseller, Drumont's book exposed what he maintained was the evil power of Jewish finance. In the wake of this success, Drumont created the National Anti-Semitic League, dedicated to fighting the clandestine and merciless conspiracy of Jewish finance, which jeopardizes daily the welfare, honor, and security of France. In 1892, Drumont founded La Libre Parole, which became one of the country's most popular newspapers. It led a campaign to drive Jewish officers out of the French army. After it was discovered that military secrets had been passed to Germany from a member of the French General Staff, Dreyfus fell under suspicion because he was Jewish and disliked by his fellow officers. But after his arrest, no evidence could be found linking him to the act. At the École Militaire, the officers in charge of Dreyfus's investigation fabricated a so-called secret file, proving Dreyfus's guilt. Military authorities then ordered Dreyfus's immediate court-martial. The proceedings were held in private, and the secret file kept from the defense. Throughout the trial proceedings, Drumont continued to fan the flames of anti-Semitism. The French public took to the streets, not only against Dreyfus, but also the French Jewish community. Not far from Theodor Herzl's hotel room, en Rue Cambon, there were nightly demonstrations in the Place de la Concorde. Through his windows, he could hear the crowd screaming, "Death to the Jews!" Where was this happening, Herzl asked himself.
Where? In France. In Republican, modern, civilized France. 100 years after the Declaration of the Rights of Man.
But what troubled him even more profoundly were the events that occurred after Dreyfus was pronounced guilty at the end of December 1894 and sentenced to life imprisonment on Devil's Island. Herzl was one of the few journalists allowed to witness Dreyfus's public degradation in January 1895.
It was a bitterly cold January morning. It happened to be the Sabbath. Dreyfus was marched around the École Militaire in front of a garrison of troops. He had his uniform, all the buttons on his uniform, ripped off by this giant of a man who descended from his horse and publicly humiliated Dreyfus. And the Parisian mob who are behind the railings but are watching the scene, several thousand people, they are screaming, "Down with the traitor." And there are also cries of "Death to the Jew," "Mort aux Juifs," which come from this almost hysterical mob who are baying for Dreyfus's blood. Herzl is in the journalist's box. He notes that twice, as Dreyfus is marched around, he stops where he sees the journalist and he shouts, "I am innocent. You are convicting an innocent man. Vive la France. Long live France. Vive l'armée. Long live the army."
That night, in a state of what he would later call strange agitation, Herzl wrote his dispatch for the Neue Freie Presse. In Vienna, the newspaper censored the report, changing his account of the mob shouting "Death to the Jews" to "Death to the Judas." In a later edition, the Neue Freie Presse changed it even further to "Death to the Traitors." Herzl's editors, themselves Jews, were worried that the truth would inspire similar chants to occur in the streets of Vienna. Although he tried, Herzl could not shake the scenes of the trial and the anti-Semitic demonstrations from his mind. He woke up to the French newspapers editorializing that Dreyfus's protests of innocence were even further examples of Jewish duplicity. He became even more disturbed when a few days later the French National Assembly introduced legislation that would ban Jews from public service. It was defeated by less than 70 votes. And news from Vienna, where his family was living, added to his anxiety. Anti-Semitic factions had reached a majority status in the Austrian parliament. There were calls for expulsion of the Jews from the country and the confiscation of their property. During the first 3 months of 1895, all of the events Theodor Herzl was witnessing and writing about for the Neue Freie Presse were transforming him. He began writing a diary, trying to describe the process he was undergoing. Much of what Herzl was writing about involved finding a solution to the Jewish question.
I ask the cultivated men whom I am addressing to set many preconceived ideas entirely aside. I shall even go as far as to ask those Jews who have earnestly tried to solve the Jewish question to look upon their previous attempts as mistaken and futile.
By the spring of 1895, Herzl had decided that he needed to take drastic action. He would spearhead an international effort to solve the Jewish problem as he saw it. He might have been the most unlikely person to lead such a campaign. Theodor Herzl was born on May 2, 1860, in the heart of the Jewish community of Budapest, Hungary. In fact, the Herzl family's home was adjacent to the Dohány Synagogue, one of Budapest's most prominent buildings and the largest synagogue in Europe. Herzl's father, Jacob, was born to a poor Orthodox Jewish family in Yugoslavia and came to Budapest in 1856, where he made a success of himself in banking. Like many from the rural villages or shtetls, he moved to Budapest after residence restrictions against Jews in the Austro-Hungarian Empire were lifted. In 1857, he married Jeanette Diamant, the daughter of a wealthy merchant. Jeanette's family background could not have been more different than Jacob's. The Diamants had been living in Budapest for 3 generations and were not religious Jews. Their first child, Pauline, was born a year after their marriage, followed by Theodor 2 years later. Jeanette focused much of her attention on Dori, as he was called by the family. She passed on her love of German poetry and literature to him when he was very young. Theodor was said to have been able to recite Goethe and Schiller by heart, in German, before the age of 8. Despite Jacob's religious upbringing, the Herzls, like most Budapest Jews, were quite assimilated. For that reason, on Theodor's 13th birthday, guests were invited not to a bar mitzvah, but rather to a confirmation reception at the family's new home, not far from the Danube. In 1878, Jacob and Jeanette Herzl decided to move the family home from Budapest. Many Jews were leaving the city at that time because they were uncomfortable with the growing nationalism of the Hungarian people. Jacob set his sights on Vienna, not only more hospitable to Jews at that moment, but also a place with much better business prospects for him. The plan was for the family to move in the spring, after Theodor's final exams. But on February 7th, 1878, tragedy struck. A typhoid epidemic had been raging through Budapest. Pauline Herzl fell victim to it and died within days. She was only 19 years old. Jeanette was so grief-stricken that, even though Theodor still had 4 months of high school to complete, she insisted on immediately moving to Vienna. The family's new home was on the Praterstraße in Leopoldstadt, an elegant, predominantly Jewish district of the city. That fall, Herzl began his classes at the University of Vienna Faculty of Law. His course of study, chosen by his parents, held very little interest for him. Instead of focusing on his classes, he concentrated on his literary pursuits, writing dozens of poems, short stories, novellas, and plays. In 1881, Herzl, like many of his fellow university students, joined a so-called dueling fraternity named Albia. Belonging to one was essential to career advancement and a higher rank in the military. They were called dueling fraternities because acceptance required fighting a duel and getting a scar. Herzl's scar, or Schmiss, was a small one, requiring only 1 stitch. But many of its members made no secret about their unhappiness that Jews were being allowed to join. For this reason, it was not long before Herzl found himself disenchanted with his new fraternity, and he became an inactive member. But it was an event on March the 5th, 1883, that led to a full break between him and his fraternity. A memorial service was taking place at the Sophiensaal, a popular Vienna social hall, for composer Richard Wagner, who had died 3 weeks previously. One of the featured speakers was a prominent member of Albia, Hermann Bahr, who proceeded to deliver a violently anti-Semitic address. Herzl was infuriated by the speech and demanded that his fraternity condemn Bahr's remarks. When that did not happen, he wrote to its steering committee.
Even if I were a non-Jew, I would feel compelled by sheer love of freedom to oppose a movement with which my fraternity has also allied itself. I request severance of my links to the fraternity.
Upon graduating, Theodor Herzl began working as a trainee lawyer first in Vienna and then in Salzburg. Many years later, he would proclaim that he had spent some of his happiest hours working in the courts at the high Salzburg castle and that he might have remained there forever. But because advancement in the legal profession was limited to Jews, Herzl walked away from the law at the end of his training year. He returned to Vienna and decided to concentrate his energies on his first love, writing. He began work on a play and also spent time polishing several older ones he'd written during his student days. For close to 2 years, he received one rejection after another from the producers he sent his plays to. By 1885, he was in deep despair.
Miserable, miserable life. No success. When is it time?
And then, in the fall, he received some good news. A German-language theatre company in New York City decided to mount a production of his play entitled Tabarin. That November, at the Star Theatre on 13th Street and Broadway, Theodor Herzl had his professional debut as a playwright. The production received excellent reviews in newspapers in New York, Berlin, and Vienna. Herzl was now confident that he would soon achieve his main goal as a playwright, getting one of his plays produced by Vienna's fabled Burgtheater, perhaps the most prestigious in Europe. But the attention surrounding his New York debut was short-lived, and once again he was met with rejection from every theatre company to whom he sent his plays. Yet as his theatrical career was stalled, Herzl unintentionally began to make a name for himself in another field of writing. On a European vacation, Herzl had written a number of short observational pieces called feuilletons that ended up being published in several German and Austrian newspapers. Soon, he was contributing regularly for some of the best-known newspapers in Vienna, including the highly esteemed Neue Freie Presse, where he still dreamed of success at the Burgtheater. And not long after he began his newspaper career, that dream finally came true. 2 of his plays were accepted by the Burgtheater's management and produced to great public acclaim. During this same period, Theodor Herzl met and fell in love with Julie Naschauer, the daughter of a Viennese Jewish millionaire industrialist. Despite all his recent success, Herzl was not whom Julie's father, Jacob Naschauer, had in mind as a husband for his daughter. However, Julie was used to getting her way, and her parents gave their blessing, albeit reluctantly, to the engagement. The wedding ceremony took place in June 1889 in the resort town of Reichenau, a few hours outside of Vienna, where his bride's parents kept a weekend home. The wedding was quite lavish, and Julie's dowry befit her father's status as a millionaire. But trouble between the two started almost as soon as they began their 2-month honeymoon to Switzerland and France.
She appears to have been very highly strung, neurotic, a big spender. She did not identify with Herzl's literary and artistic ambitions. The marriage seems to have got off to such a bad start that Herzl was contemplating divorce within a year or so.
The birth of their daughter Pauline, named for Herzl's sister, just shy of their first anniversary, seemed to have saved the marriage for the moment. This became a pattern for the couple as they separated and reconciled numerous times, while their family grew with the birth of their son Hans, and later, Trudy. By the summer of 1891, Herzl was now one of the Neue Freie Presse's most celebrated columnists. Publishers Edward Bacher and Maurice Benedict decided to offer their rising star a new position before someone else hired him away.
They chose him to be their foreign correspondent in Paris, which was probably the most attractive proposition that any correspondent or any journalist could hope for. Paris was considered the center of modern European culture. Its politics were clearly important because France was one of the leading great powers in the world.
Herzl immediately took to the job and to the City of Lights. He focused on covering the political debates at the Palais Bourbon and enjoying the city's unique nightlife.
Dear parents, I am busy from the early morning until the evening. I really believe that I am now in my element.
By the spring of 1892, Julie and the children joined him, and the family moved into a flat in one of Paris's most stylish neighborhoods. At almost the same time, an event took place that would not only rock France, but shake Herzl to his core as well. A duel between a high-ranking Jewish army captain, Armand Meyer, and an outspoken anti-Jewish aristocrat ended in Meyer's death. Herzl took part in the captain's funeral procession, where onlookers shouted "Dirty Jews" at the mourners. In subsequent weeks, while covering the French Parliament, he witnessed angry debates on the so-called Jewish question. And at a political rally, he heard the cry, "Death to the Jews," for the very first time.
And Herzl writes about this, an article called French Anti-Semites. It's the first time he addresses the question. And this is a period in which he's constantly weighing, for the first time in his life, the significance of this issue as a societal problem.
Herzl began to brood about this constantly. He had spent little, if any, time thinking about his Jewishness since his university days in the early 1880s. He decided to read Drumont's La France Juive, which had sold more than 1 million copies in France since its publication 7 years previously. It left him very disturbed about the future of the country. His dispatches from Paris throughout the winter and spring of 1893 focused increasingly on the troubled political scene in France and what he saw as the country's slide into barbarism. To his friends, he became outspoken about the situation. By April, his name appeared on a list of suspect foreigners submitted to the Minister of the Interior by the secret police. Reports from Vienna added to his worries, where the popularity of Karl Lueger, the stridently anti-Jewish leader of Austria's Christian Socialist Party, was growing tremendously. He now became obsessed with finding a solution to anti-Semitism. Over the course of the next year, Herzl considered several approaches to attacking the problem head-on. He proposed challenging Europe's leading anti-Semites to a duel. He devised a plan where Europe's Jews would undergo a mass conversion at a ceremony at St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna. And he wrote his first new play in years that he believed would put a spotlight on anti-Semitism and lead to a debate that would put an end to it once and for all. But after time, he concluded that none of these solutions were feasible. He grew depressed about the fact that nothing he came up with to solve the problem seemed reasonable.
Night after night, I write down prophecies that never materialize, confessions of faith that are never acted upon, declarations that lead to nowhere.
As he was covering the French elections of 1894, Herzl contracted a form of malaria that left him bedridden for much of the winter and permanently damaged his heart. As he continued his convalescence at Lake Aussee, on the family's annual summer holiday, he saw old friends and visited his parents at their nearby summer home. The talk amongst them all centered around the latest anti-Semitic incidents throughout Europe. Newspaper reports from Vienna, Berlin, Paris, and Prague described one anti-Semitic attack after another. At summer's end, Julie announced to him that she and the children would return to Vienna rather than Paris. Her father was dying, and she felt it was better to be at home. Herzl moved into a room at the Hotel Castile on Rue Gambon, where he began reporting on the Dreyfus trial unfolding at the École Militaire. During this period of time, he decided to attend services at Paris's Grand Synagogue on Rue Victoire, not far from where he was living. It had been the first time he set foot in one since childhood. He found himself incredibly moved by the services, and for the first time, as an adult, discovered a connection to other Jews. He left the synagogue making an even greater commitment to himself to help the Jewish people. In the weeks following Captain Dreyfus's degradation at the École Militaire, it appeared to Herzl that all of Europe was on a rampage against the Jews. He became convinced that by remaining in Europe, the Jews were facing an apocalypse. As he saw it, they needed to leave and create a sovereign Jewish state in another place. But where? Palestine was an obvious choice. Jews had been returning to their biblical home there for well over 100 years. Then there was Argentina. Jews had been settling in farming communities there since the late 1800s. These settlements were underwritten by Jewish philanthropists like Baron Maurice von Hirsch, the Bavarian-born railroad tycoon, whose fortune was one of the largest in the world. Von Hirsch was one of the few rich men of the time who believed in sharing his wealth with the poor. It was estimated that he had spent upwards of 400 million francs on Jewish charities alone. Herzl decided to approach the Baron, who lived in Paris, with a proposal that he underwrite the financing of an efficient, well-planned mass exodus of Jews from Europe and the purchase of territory for the new state. Baron von Hirsch consented to a meeting, most likely because of Herzl's reputation as a journalist. The get-together started off poorly. The Baron kept Herzl waiting. When he finally came in, Herzl addressed him harshly and began criticizing the industrialists' resettlement projects in Argentina.
You should have started the whole thing differently. You drag these farm Jews overseas. They must think they will be supported by you forever. This does not promote eagerness to work. You are breeding schnorrers.
Herzl then began to discuss what he believed was needed to help the Jewish people.
The first task is to improve the race here and now. The Jews must be made strong, eager to work, and virtuous.
Baron von Hirsch lost his temper with his guest.
No, I don't want to raise the general level at all. All our misery comes from Jews who want to climb too high. We have too many intellectuals. I want to keep the Jews from always wanting to get ahead.
Herzl then raised his scheme for a mass exodus of Jews from Europe.
Where are you going to find the money? Rothschild will give you 500 francs.
The money? I'll raise a Jewish national loan of 10 million marks.
A fantasy. The rich Jews will give you nothing.
Without ceremony, the Baron brought the meeting to a close. He told Herzl that he might be willing to see him when he returned from a business trip to London. Herzl would never hear from von Hirsch again. In the days after his encounter with the Baron, Herzl began composing a series of documents that would become the most significant he would write. They would include his innermost thoughts about why a state was needed, the nature of that entity, and what was required to make it a reality.
I have been pounding away for some time at a work of tremendous magnitude. I don't even know now if I will be able to carry it through. For days and weeks it has saturated me to the limits of my consciousness. It goes with me everywhere.
During the same period of time, Herzl also decided to draft a proposal to the famed Rothschild family about his ideas, since his appeal to von Hirsch seemed to have been fruitless. When it was finished, it ran 68 pages, containing details about the new country's economic system, its form of government, its military, arts, and culture. He explained that the national language would be German, much closer to the Yiddish that most Jews spoke at the time, and that the state would not be a theocracy. But he also had some blunt talk for the Rothschilds.
You are rich enough, gentlemen, to further this plan, but you're not rich enough to prevent it.
And he had a stark warning for the family that even with all of their wealth, they were not immune from anti-Semitism.
Your fortune will be expropriated, and like all Jews, you will be expelled from some countries, and in those where we seek refuge, they will kill us. I bring you the salvation.
For weeks, Herzl did nothing but work on his diaries and his proposals to the Rothschilds, which he intended to deliver as a speech to their family council. He neglected his work at the Neue Freie Presse and rarely left his room at the Hotel Castile. The nearby Tuileries was one place he would venture out to, wandering aimlessly at night, talking to himself and thinking about all the details of his plans that needed to be sorted out. The Opéra de Paris was another location he turned to for inspiration, especially when Wagner's works were being performed. During a performance of Tannhäuser that he attended one evening, he vowed to himself that one of the first acts of the new Jewish state would be to build an opera house to rival Paris's.
We too are going to have such resplendent halls. Men in formal black tie, ladies in high fashion. Yes, I want to make use of everything, including the Jewish love of luxury.
After completing his speech to the Rothschilds, Herzl wrote to Vienna's chief rabbi, Maurice Gudemann. He asked the rabbi, who had close ties to Albert von Rothschild, the head of the Austrian branch of the family, to arrange an urgent meeting on his behalf to help the Jewish people. Gudemann did not take Herzl's letter seriously and never forwarded his request to von Rothschild. Not long after writing to Rabbi Gudemann, a close friend of Herzl's, who was also a physician, stopped by at the Hotel Castile to see him. He was shocked at his appearance and became even more disturbed as he started reading to him from his speech to the Rothschilds. He was sure that Herzl had suffered a nervous collapse. He took his pulse and found that it was racing.
My dear friend, there is something wrong with your nerves. This book is a product of sickness.
He became even more alarmed when Herzl told him he had written about all of this to Rabbi Gudemann.
The rabbi will rush to your parents and inform them that their son has had a mental breakdown.
Now Herzl became panicked. The last thing he wanted to do was to upset his parents. After the doctor left, he went out and began walking again in the Tuileries, trying to figure out what to do. By evening, he decided to give up his scheme to create a new Jewish nation. And then he received a letter from his mother, in which she enclosed a poem she had clipped from the Neue Freie Presse.
Weaknesses are easily forgiven to the crowd. To you, their leader, they are not allowed.
The poem had an immediate effect on Herzl. He started believing again in the ideas that he had abandoned a few days before. He scribbled a note to himself from the margin of the clipping.
From my good mamma, who copied it for me and sent it while I was working on the plan, as if Mother Heart divined it.
Vienna, during the summer of 1895, turned into a hotbed of anti-Jewish violence. Even Sigmund Freud was now taking notice of the problem.
I have been given the first glimpse into the abyss. I have seen things calculated to sober and even frighten me.
As Herzl vacationed with his family that summer at Lake Aussee, he was not able to escape Austria's anti-Semitism, even amidst the beauty of the area. One day, at a cabin near the lake, he came upon walls filled with anti-Jewish graffiti. Herzl copied one example into his notebook.
O God, return Moses to this land to take his Jews by the hand and lead them to their promised land. And when the whole bad lot's afloat in the middle of the sea, then, good Lord, just sink the boat, and all good Christians will be free.
Chief Rabbi Maurice Gudemann, who had been dismissive of Herzl a few months previously, was now very interested in what he had to say about the problem of anti-Semitism in Europe. A meeting was scheduled in Munich. At an elegant hotel on the Sabbath, Herzl outlined his proposals for the Jewish exodus from Europe and the new state. He shared details from his speech to the Rothschilds. Rabbi Gudemann became so enthusiastic about what Herzl was discussing that he exclaimed to the journalist, "You remind me of Moses." Yet, despite expressing such sentiments, that evening the rabbi wrote a postcard to his wife.
Herzl is a poet. His plan, however interesting, is not feasible.
Herzl moved back to Vienna in the fall, rather than return to Paris. His Neue Freie Presse editors wanted him in Austria to serve as the paper's new literary editor. By then, he'd been away from home for 5 years. He was a much different man than he had been when he left for Paris in 1891. He and the family moved into a home on the Pelikangasse, a stylish area near the university. Herzl's new passion quickly caused strains with his employers. He suggested they publish a special Sunday edition with a front-page story he had written entitled "The Solution to the Jewish Question." His request was dismissed out of hand. Herzl felt quite dejected by the decision. But his spirits were lifted after being in touch with Max Nordau, an old friend in Paris who had become an ardent supporter of his idea of creating a Jewish state. "If you are insane, then we are insane together," the best-selling author and social scientist told Herzl when they met. He convinced him to make a trip to London, where he was certain there would be tremendous support for his ideas. While Herzl did not know a single person in the city, and his English was limited, within days he was speaking with the leaders of the city's Jewish community and gave a triumphant speech to the Maccabean Club. His first public talk about his views was rewarded with a standing ovation. Herzl left England excited and determined to build a Zionist movement. As soon as he returned to Vienna at the end of 1895, he adapted his speech to the Rothschilds into an 86-page booklet entitled Der Judenstaat, or The Jewish State, an attempt at a modern solution of the Jewish question.
No one can deny the gravity of the situation of the Jews. Wherever they live in perceptible numbers, they are more or less persecuted. Everything tends, in fact, to one and the same conclusion, clearly enunciated in the classic Berlin phrase, Juden raus, Jews get out. I shall now put the question in the briefest possible form. Are we to get out now? And where to?
In the booklet, Herzl explained why he believed Palestine, for historic and religious reasons, should be the home for the new Jewish state.
The Jews have dreamt this kingly dream all through the nights of their history. Next year in Jerusalem is our old phrase. It is now a question of showing that the dream can be converted into a living reality.
Only a tiny publisher with a bookstore on Vienna's Weiningerstrasse, M. Breitenstein, was willing to take a chance publishing Der Judenstaat. While Breitenstein displayed a few copies of the book in its store window, the bulk of the printing run, 500 copies, was sent to Herzl's home a few streets away. As he opened one of the boxes, he could not contain his excitement.
I was terribly shaken. This package of pamphlets constitutes the decision in tangible form. My life may now take a new turn.
His prediction came true when the London Jewish Chronicle published an excerpt from his book, sparking great interest across Europe. When the wire services identified Herzl as the literary editor of the Neue Freie Presse, his editors were furious. Moritz Benedict offered to pay him to withdraw the Jewish state from publication.
No individual has the right to take upon himself the tremendous moral responsibility of setting this avalanche in motion. We shall lose our present country before we get a Jewish state. The pamphlet is unripe for publication. You are risking your literary reputation.
But Herzl refused to take his editor's offer.
I have already published the idea. It no longer belongs to me, but to all Jews. If I keep silent now, I endanger my reputation all the more.
Very quickly, the Jewish state became one of the main topics of conversation in Vienna, not all of it complimentary. Vienna's cafes were filled with people joking about Theodor Herzl's new Jewish state. Behind his back, he was being called the Redeemer from the Pelikangasse. One evening, as Herzl entered the Burgtheater, people laughed at him as he made his way to his seat. He heard whispers of, "His Majesty has arrived," and "Herzl the King." One prominent member of Vienna's Jewish community was asked what he was willing to do for Herzl's cause.
If Herzl should be taken to the lunatic asylum, I shall be glad to put my carriage at his disposal.
Yet Herzl, who had always been sensitive to criticism, ignored the jibes.
In order to be proved right in 30 years, one has to be prepared in the first few weeks to be considered a madman.
In political circles, Herzl was condemned by everyone, from the Prime Minister to the aging Emperor Franz Joseph. Orthodox Jewish leaders were also up in arms.
The Orthodox Jews said that he was anticipating the Messiah, that he was an adventurer, and that only God in his own time could bring about the redemption and the gathering in of the exiles. But so were the Reform rabbis, by and large, in most of the world. They were alarmed at this affront to their notion of patriotism. Patriotism not for a Jewish state, but for full integration in their own society.
Ironically, one of those most supportive was Hermann Bahr, Herzl's old fraternity brother, whose anti-Jewish speech caused his resignation from Albia. Bahr had long renounced his anti-Jewish views and became a well-known and respected author. He had written an international survey of anti-Semitism and concluded that it was a new madness. Another admirer was Sigmund Freud, who would later send a copy of his seminal book, The Interpretation of Dreams, to Herzl with a letter praising him for being a fighter for the human rights of our people. Herzl also received the almost unanimous endorsement from the Jewish student fraternities at the University of Vienna. At the University of Berlin, a group of Russian Jewish medical students who had been Zionists for years were jolted by Herzl's book. One of them was a 22-year-old named Chaim Weizmann. And veteran Zionists throughout Eastern Europe and Russia, and even the small settlements in Palestine who had joined the cause decades earlier, also jumped on his bandwagon. In the shtetl of Plonsk in Poland, a 10-year-old boy, David Gruen, heard talk that the Messiah had arrived, a tall, handsome man, a learned man of Vienna, a doctor no less, Theodor Herzl. Letters of support by the hundreds started arriving at the Herzl home on Pelikangasse. A Polish rabbi wrote that 3 million Hasidim were ready to join the movement. Julie was horrified when supporters started showing up at their front door. The majority of them were poor Eastern European Jews for whom she had no affinity. They were the last people she wanted in her elegant home. One of the more unusual visitors was the Reverend William Hechler. The Anglican minister showed up and insisted that it was his destiny to arrange a meeting between Herzl and Germany's Grand Duke of Baden, who was also the uncle of Kaiser Wilhelm II. Herzl was taken aback by the flamboyant reverend, who asked if he would be willing to pay his expenses to travel to Germany to meet with the Grand Duke in order to set up the royal audience. Still, he was willing to risk a few hundred gulden if there was a chance that Reverend Hechler could make good on his word, which he did a few weeks later when he summoned Herzl to come to the Grand Duke's estate in Germany. A nervous Herzl fretted over his remarks and worried about what to wear. But rather than being intimidated by the Grand Duke, the Zionist leader charmed and impressed the royal for the better part of 2.5 hours. He outlined a scheme where world Jewry would pay off the huge foreign debt of Sultan Abdul Hamid and the Ottoman Empire, which controlled Palestine. In exchange, the Jews would be granted Palestine for their new state. Herzl wanted the Kaiser's assistance in convincing Abdul Hamid to go along with the plan. By the end of the meeting, the Grand Duke was fully committed to helping Herzl realize his goal. He agreed to use his influence to help him gain a meeting with his nephew. Leaving the Duke's estate, Herzl was in a daze. He could not believe what he had just accomplished. 12 months previously, he was rejected by Baron von Hirsch. Now, he was a step away from meeting with the Kaiser. Writing in his diaries, he reflected on what he had accomplished in a year's time.
If during the coming year I make relatively the same progress from the 0 point of last year, then we shall be L'Shana Haba b'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem.
Herzl returned home to more good news. One of his contacts had been in touch with government officials in Constantinople. The word was that Sultan Abdul Hamid was willing to meet with him. Herzl was soon on his way to Turkey. Constantinople, Herzl found himself going from one meeting to the next, paying off one Turkish official after another in what he quickly learned was the custom in the Ottoman Empire, all in the hope of seeing Abdul Hamid. Despite getting a glimpse of him at one of his main residences, and even being invited on an inspection tour on the Bosphorus of his palaces, the promised audience with the Sultan never took place. The officials, to whom Herzl had paid lavish bribes, insisted that a meeting would happen during his next visit. At his hotel the evening before his departure, Herzl was extremely depressed, and then a gift arrived for him from one of the royal palaces. A box containing the Commander's Cross of the Ottoman Empire from the Sultan himself. His mood changed. Herzl wrote in his diary that the trip had been a brilliant success. He was certain that he had laid the foundation for the future negotiations with the Ottoman Turks. On his way home, Herzl stopped off in Paris to convene with Max Nordau, who bolstered his spirits by marveling over everything he had accomplished in Turkey. With Nordau's help, he secured a meeting with Edmund de Rothschild, whose family charities had been supporting a number of Jewish colonies throughout Palestine. Herzl was hoping that Rothschild would be willing to help him in his negotiations with the Sultan. But it turned out that the French banking heir had yet to read The Jewish State and had absolutely no interest in the idea of a mass exodus of Jews to Palestine.
It would be impossible to control the influx of the masses into Palestine. The first to arrive would be 150,000 beggars. They would have to be fed, presumably by me, and there could be unforeseen mishaps.
Herzl responded furiously.
Are there no mishaps now? Is anti-Semitism not a permanent mishap with loss of honor, life, and property?
For several hours, the two men argued bitterly. When it became clear to Herzl that he was getting nowhere with his case, he decided to leave. Back at his old Paris haunt, the Hotel Castile, he expressed his frustrations about the meeting to an associate.
There's only one answer. Organize our masses at once. Let us get them ready to go stand by for a word of command. As a means of agitation, I suggest the flag with 7 gold stars. Here's my design for it.
When he returned to Vienna, after more than 6 weeks away from his family, he returned to a new home, a more elegant address on the Berggasse, near the house of Sigmund Freud. As 1897 began, Herzl was receiving hundreds of supporters at his home, and preparations were in full swing for an international conference of Zionists that he wanted to convene that August. He was also forced to go back to work at the Neue Freie Presse, more dependent upon his job than ever because of his diminishing finances. The strain on his health was becoming apparent. His heart, damaged from his bouts of malaria in France years before, was causing him problems, forcing him at times to take to his bed. Fearing his own mortality, he wrote his last will and testament. In a letter to a friend, he explained,
"We must think of the future. The movement must not rest on 2 eyes. The idea must not die with me."
A few weeks later, Herzl announced the creation of Die Welt, or The World, a Zionist weekly, initially financed by his father and himself. The announcement led to yet another battle with Moritz Benedict.
I speak as your true friend. You only do yourself harm by standing up as a Jew. Heed my friendly advice. Promise me that you will close down Die Welt.
But Herzl ignored his publisher and even went as far as cleaning out his desk at the Neue Freie Presse, fully expecting to be fired. Yet because he was one of the paper's most popular columnists, his job remained secure. He later jotted in his diary,
"The greatest happiness, to be able to be what one really is."
During the spring, Herzl convened a conference of his deputies in Vienna to organize the Zionist Congress he wanted to hold that August. Among other things, it was decided to hold the conference in Munich, a central location with plenty of kosher restaurants and hotels. But as soon as the word got out about the Congress, trouble began developing. Vienna Chief Rabbi Moritz Gudemann, who a year and a half earlier had likened Herzl to Moses, wrote an attack against Zionism, insisting that Judaism and nationalism were not compatible. In Berlin, the Rabbinical Council of Germany also published a strong statement against the Zionist movement and the plans for a congress. This led to protests from Munich's Jewish leadership about holding the Zionist Congress in their city. An angry Herzl decided to move the convocation to Basel, Switzerland, where he had more support from the local Jewish community. Herzl arrived at Basel's hotel Les Trois Rois, overlooking the Rhine, a few days before the Congress was to begin. He quickly rented the Stadt Casino, a well-known concert hall in the small Swiss city, for the assembly. And then the delegates, more than 200 of them from 17 countries, started to arrive. They had come to the Congress seeking a life beyond pogroms and religious persecution. They could hardly contain their excitement over what they believed was about to happen for the Jewish people. They were sure that they were transforming the dream of returning the Jewish people to the land of Israel into a reality.
This was the first gathering on such a scale that had taken place for almost 2,000 years. Delegates coming from all over the world, different Jewish communities, meeting in Basel to establish a Jewish national home in Palestine, recognized in international law.
The delegates hailed from all over Europe, North Africa, Palestine, and America. There were lawyers from Vienna, bankers from Holland and Sweden, along with professors and students from Germany, as well as shopkeepers from Poland and Hungary. Some were rich and others poor. Many were young men from Eastern Europe and Russia, carrying satchels of food with them from home prepared by their wives and mothers for the long journey, primarily by third-class rail. The religious mingled with the secular. One group that stayed away was the Jewish aristocracy. And so did the Neue Freie Presse. While more than 30 members of the world press covered the Congress, Herzl's editors, who were angrily opposed to his Zionist activities, chose not to send a reporter and never mentioned one word about the conference in the paper. Julie Herzl was also a no-show. She and her husband had argued for weeks because she refused to attend. She disapproved of her husband's Zionist activities even more than his employers did. What had happened to the prominent journalist she had married, she demanded, the well-known man about town, who was now leading an ethnic cause she had no interest in whatsoever? Herzl's experience in the theatre gave him a sense of how to choreograph the event. He personally supervised the lighting, the stage setting, and even how the delegates would dress. That evening, as he walked to the podium to deliver his inaugural address, Theodor Herzl was greeted with the stomping of feet and a thunderous ovation. People reached out to kiss his hand as he walked by. On the stage, as he tried to begin his speech, the cheers of the crowd would not end. One delegate, the Hebrew writer Ben Ami, recorded how among the cheers one could hear the cries of Yehi HaMelech, long live the king. When he finally got the opportunity to speak, Herzl went straight to the point. He explained that they needed to set up an organization to negotiate with the great powers, and specifically with the Ottoman Empire, to achieve Jewish settlement in Palestine on a large scale. Jewish colonization should no longer be conducted in secret and must be in accord with international law. Herzl concluded that the goal of the Zionist Congress was to create a new kind of Jew.
A people can only help itself. If it cannot, that people cannot be helped at all. We want to lay the cornerstone of the edifice that is one day to house the Jewish nation. We have come home, as it were. Zionism is our return to Judaism even before our return to the Jewish land.
When Herzl finished his speech, pandemonium once again broke out. The crowd rushed to the stage, knocking over chairs and tables. A woman in the gallery fainted. As Herzl rested in his hotel room for the first time in days, he took a moment to write in his diary.
The man who brought to Basel the daydreams he had had in the Tuileries Gardens 2 years before, that man may yet sail the Mediterranean Sea as a Jew returning home.
On the Sabbath, a day before the first Zionist Congress opened, Theodor Herzl and Max Nordau, who could count on less than one hand the number of times they had been to synagogue as adults, decided to attend services out of respect to the religious delegates who were coming and the Jewish community of Basel. When the Zionist leader was called up to the Torah to say the blessings, there was a hush as he recited them perfectly, without pause. Herzl's trip to the synagogue was also evidence of a growing relationship with Basel's Rabbi Arthur Cohen, who also served as chief rabbi of Switzerland. At the closing session of the Congress, one of the most emotional moments occurred when Rabbi Cohen came to the podium and recalled how several weeks earlier he, like most of Europe's rabbis, spoke out against Zionism. But now, he explained, that after listening to the speeches of the past few days and meeting with Herzl, he had a change of heart. He was now a supporter of the movement. The rabbi expressed that he had only one concern about the new Jewish state. Would the Sabbath and other doctrines of the faith be kept? Herzl rose from his chair and answered him.
Judaism has nothing to fear from the Jewish state.
Rabbi Cohen responded that he would now dedicate his life to the Zionist cause.
My grandfather was a man not only of an enormous wisdom, he had an enormous wisdom of life, and his vision was that the future of Judaism must be linked with something like what Theodor Herzl wanted. The greatness of the whole thing is Herzl himself, an assimilated Jew with no knowledge whatsoever about any details of Judaism, insists that we absolutely need an Orthodox rabbi, because if we don't have that, we will not have the Orthodox Jewry, and if we don't have the Orthodox Jewry, the whole Zionist movement will have no future.
As Herzl announced the first Zionist Congress is now closed, a celebration took place that even the Zionist newspaper Die Welt maintained was hard to adequately describe. Delegates danced and sang while embracing and kissing. Women waved handkerchiefs. Throughout the hall, cries of "Next year in Jerusalem" could be heard. The scene went on for more than an hour. In the days following, the delegates meditated on how profoundly the experience had not only changed them, but the future of the Jewish people as well. Leib Yaffe from Grodno spoke for many.
For us, the first Congress was a crisis that changed our fate. It revolutionized our entire world and divided the history of our exile into two parts. The first, before the Congress, and the second, the part that came after.
Writer Israel Zangwill, a delegate from England, was known for being a skeptic and a cynic. He was uncharacteristically emotional when he wrote about the Congress.
By the rivers of Babylon, we sat down and wept as we remembered Zion. By the river of Basel, we sat down and resolved to weep no more.
Not long after its end, Theodor Herzl also reflected on what had been accomplished at the first Zionist Congress.
Were I to sum up the Basel Congress in a few words, it would be this. In Basel, I founded the Jewish state. If I said this aloud today, I would be answered by universal laughter. Perhaps in 5 years, and certainly in 50, everyone will agree.
the Zionist Congress profoundly changed Herzl's personal life as well. That December, there was no Christmas tree in his house. Instead, Hanukkah was celebrated. Just before the holiday, Herzl penned an autobiographical short story entitled The Menorah.
There was a man who felt deep in his heart the distress of being a Jew. He had long ignored his Jewish origin. Then the old hatred rose again. Like many others, he believed that the trend would soon disappear, but it grew worse. The mounting assault pained him until his soul was one bleeding wound. And it came to pass that through these inner, muted passions, he was led to their source, to his Judaism. Out of dark feelings grew clear thoughts. He uttered them aloud. The one way out of the misery of being Jewish is to return to Jewishness.
Throughout 1898, Herzl and the Zionist movement continued to gain credibility around the world. By the fall, he received word that Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II was ready to endorse his plan. The emperor was willing to meet with Herzl in Constantinople, where he was on his way to the Holy Land for a pilgrimage. Wilhelm II had no great love for the Jews. He was known to call them kikes, and felt that their persecution was deserved for having been responsible for the killing of Jesus. That October, when the audience took place in Constantinople in one of the Sultan's palaces, the Kaiser was very blunt with Herzl.
There are elements among your people for whom it would be a good thing to move to Palestine. There are usurers at work among the rural population. If these people settled in the colonies with their possessions, they would be more useful citizens.
Herzl became so irritated that he almost lost his composure.
Jews are neither better nor worse than other people. Anti-Semitism is stabbing the very best of us right to the heart. We have been deeply hurt. After all, we will be taking the Jews away from the revolutionary parties.
Herzl's remarks disarmed the situation. The Kaiser announced that he would receive the Zionist leader and his delegation in Jerusalem, where, in a formal setting, Herzl could present his plan in a speech to the royal party. A few days later, Herzl and his delegation were aboard a steamship on their way to Palestine.
About 7 o'clock, the first touch of land. 2 little mountain tops was sighted.
The delegation arrived in Jaffa harbor early on October 26th. The Jaffa to which Herzl arrived looked better from afar. It was a city of poverty, of mud huts and open sewers. Just 10% of the city's 32,000 residents were Jews, but many of them crowded the harbor to catch a glimpse of the author of the Jewish state. They were eager to see the man they called King of the Jews. Over the course of 2 days, Herzl and his party visited one Jewish settlement after another. One of the stops was the agricultural school of Mikveh Israel, founded in 1870. Herzl had been informed that the Kaiser would be traveling by horseback to Jerusalem, stopping at Mikveh Israel along the way. It was suggested that he try to meet Wilhelm II there. The Kaiser rode up to the gates of the settlement on a huge white stallion, and seeing Herzl, greeted him and began conversing about his impressions of Palestine. A member of the delegation had been recruited to take a photo of the Kaiser and Herzl, but he was so nervous that he only managed to capture Herzl's hand in the lens. When the error was noticed after it was developed, another member of the group had an idea. A snapshot of Herzl and a snapshot of the emperor were sent to a photo retoucher who merged the two in what became the official photo the Zionist movement sent around the world. Shortly after the encounter, Herzl and his delegation traveled by train to Jerusalem. He toured the old city and visited the Kotel, the western wall of the Second Temple.
He was disappointed with what he saw in Jerusalem. He was shocked. and taken aback by the squalor, the backwardness, the misery. At the same time, he saw the potential of the country. It didn't cast any doubts on the correctness of his vision that this would have to be the Jewish national home.
After waiting almost a week, Herzl and his delegation were finally called to see the Kaiser. Dressed in formal attire, they arrived at the emperor's encampment. Herzl started his speech by describing the nature of the Zionist dream.
We are bound to the sacred soil. Many generations have come since this land was Jewish, but the dream still lives on in the many hundreds and thousands. Whenever foes oppressed us, whenever we were begrudged our rights to live, in our depressed hearts we remembered Zion. This is the land of our fathers. It cries out for its people. No man's rights or religious feelings are threatened by our idea.
Herzl fully expected the Kaiser to respond as enthusiastically as he did in Constantinople. Wilhelm II proceeded to make small talk, discussing Palestine's water and agricultural needs for a few minutes. He then stood up and ended the meeting. As Herzl was ushered out of the royal tent, he could not believe what was happening. The Kaiser had changed his mind. The Zionist leader was in shock and did not utter a word on the way back to the hotel. The next day, he and the delegation abruptly left Palestine. Upon returning to Vienna, Herzl went back to his job at the Neue Freie Presse. It had not reported one word about his trip. He had just met with the Kaiser, something no Jew had ever done. Yet it did not merit a story in his own newspaper. On the personal front, the pressures of family and finances were greater than ever on the Zionist leader. Julie insisted that the family move to an even grander home in one of Vienna's most opulent neighborhoods, where the children were looked after by governesses and educated by private tutors, despite the fact that more than half of Julie's dowry was gone, and much of what she had inherited from her father's estate had also been spent. Financing Die Welt had cost Herzl more than 50,000 gulden, and there was no telling how much of his own funds had gone to cover his travels for the movement. In frail health for years, all of the strain in his professional and personal life was starting to take its toll. He fainted and collapsed on a number of occasions. In a diary entry he wrote on the occasion of his 41st birthday, May 2nd, 1901, he commented on how difficult the struggle had been.
The wind blows through the stubble. I must my pace redouble. It is almost 6 years since I started this movement, which has made me old, tired, and poor.
Yet Herzl was convinced that he had made the right decision in devoting himself to the cause.
Zionism has been the Sabbath of my life.
Despite his failing health, over the next 18 months, he made 3 more unsuccessful trips to Constantinople, unable to strike a deal with the Sultan for Palestine. He traveled back and forth across Europe from Vienna to London, looking to raise money for the movement. But wherever he went, the rich Jews continued to close their doors to him. Only the poor supported him financially. In order to escape the constant stress of his life, Herzl turned to writing, in this case, a novel entitled Alt Neuland, or Old New Land.
In this novel, he envisages the new Palestine, which has been settled and developed by Jews, as being at the hub of a revived, commercially advanced Middle East, which has connections with the whole world.
Alt Neuland took an idealistic position on the future of relations with the Arabs. Herzl believed that the Jews coming to Palestine would not only enrich their own lives, but those of the Arabs living there as well. The book became a bestseller around the world, and Herzl considered it his best work after the Jewish state. Not long after its publication in the spring of 1902, Herzl's beloved father Jacob died suddenly of a massive stroke.
My dear, my good, my golden one, how greatly I remain in his debt. I owe him everything. He stood by my side like a tree. Now that tree is gone.
Jacob Herzl was buried in a temporary grave in Vienna. His son refused to buy a family vault, sure that his father's remains would be transported to Palestine when the rest of the family moved there. After the mourning period ended, Herzl turned his sights on England. Even though it had almost no influence over the Ottoman Turks, the British government had adopted a sympathetic view of Zionism. He now began meeting regularly with Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain and several other officials. During one of those meetings, the Colonial Secretary and father of the future Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain proposed an idea. There was a British territory he could offer to Herzl where the Jews could move to immediately: Uganda. The Zionist leader was not interested. But then, on April 19, 1903, anti-Jewish violence broke out in the Russian town of Kishinev. Some 50 Jews were murdered, over 600 seriously wounded, thousands of shops and homes destroyed. The news reached Herzl as he was in London for another round of meetings with Chamberlain. He decided to accept the Colonial Secretary's offer of Uganda.
Herzl was driven by the thought there was not much time left. This is a man who almost has a prophetic sense that the ground is literally burning under the feet of the Jewish people. And if they don't get it in time, a catastrophe will occur. That's why he grabbed the Uganda offer, which would have been, hopefully, a temporary solution for the Jews of Russia in particular.
David Lloyd George, a prominent lawyer and a future Prime Minister of England, was engaged to draft a Jewish land charter for Uganda in time for Herzl to present it at the upcoming 6th Zionist Congress. As this was unfolding, Herzl made one of his boldest moves yet. He approached Tsarist Russia for a meeting to convince it to allow its Jews to leave and to exert pressure on the Turks to allow some form of Jewish autonomy in Palestine. The Russians had been harshly criticized around the world for the Kishinev pogrom, and the Tsarist government agreed to the meeting, hoping that it would help repair its image. Herzl arrived in St. Petersburg in early August 1903, meeting with Count Wenzel von Plehve, the Tsar's Minister of the Interior. Russian Zionists, who viewed Count von Plehve as the butcher of Kishinev, were furious. Von Plehve made no secret about how he viewed the Jewish people.
The Jews are an alien element in our society. We are justified to suppress them.
The Count explained that he was eager to see a Jewish state established so that Russia could get rid of its Jews. After almost a week of meetings, Herzl was given a letter from the Tsar formally pledging the Russian government's support for the Zionist cause on one condition: that the movement must encourage Jews to move from Russia to Palestine as soon as the homeland is established. Herzl departed from St. Petersburg, stopping overnight in Vilna, a city renowned for its Talmudic scholars, known as the Jerusalem of Lithuania. Hundreds of Jews converged upon its train station, crying, "Herzl, Herzl," and "Long live the king." Vilna's aged chief rabbi hailed him as the greatest son of the Jewish people. Herzl was then taken to a private dinner in a small village almost an hour away. Young Zionists walked all the way from Vilna just to be near him. When he returned to the city later that night, despite a heavy rain, crowds lined the streets to cheer him from the balconies as he passed by. Less than a week later, the 6th Zionist Congress opened in Basel. There were now almost 600 delegates, a testament to the huge growth of the movement since the first Congress in 1897. Those assembled were shocked at Herzl's physical appearance. The strain of the last year was evident on his lined face, his bent posture, and his predominantly grey hair and beard. The stress would only increase for Herzl as the Uganda plan was announced to the Congress.
The British government is fully aware of our movement's ultimate aims in Palestine. Uganda will never be Zion. It will serve as a provisional site for colonization.
Russian Zionists, who were already angry about his meeting with Count von Plehve, threatened a hunger strike if the Uganda proposal passed. Cries of traitor could be heard in the hall. One of the strongest protests came from Chaim Weizmann, the young chemist who had become a leader in the Russian faction. Herzl was devastated. A diary entry during the Congress was full of despair.
My heart is palpitating from fatigue. Not for a single moment did it occur to any of them that for these greatest of all accomplishments to date, I deserve a word of thanks or even a smile.
Max Nordau rallied the forces behind the Zionist leader, convincing many that Uganda could be a useful way station and could help save Jewish lives. In the end, a watered-down proposal calling only for the dispatching of an expedition of experts to investigate Uganda was passed. In his closing speech, Herzl acknowledged the controversy over Uganda.
I proposed an expedient to you, and having learned to know your hearts, I also want to offer you a word of consolation, which is at once a pledge on my part.
He then raised his right hand and proclaimed,
If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, may my right hand lose its cunning.
Following the Congress, Herzl travelled to Italy to meet with and garner the support of King Victor Emmanuel III. He was also granted an audience at the Vatican with Pope Pius X. Speaking in halting Italian, Herzl asked for the Pope's goodwill. The Pope responded that the Church could not approve of Zionism.
We cannot prevent the Hebrews from going to Jerusalem, but we could never sanction it. The Hebrews have not recognized our Lord, therefore we cannot recognize the Hebrew people. If you come to Palestine and settle your people there, we shall keep churches and priests ready to baptize all of them.
Returning to Vienna, Herzl's health began to deteriorate rapidly. To a friend, he remarked that his days might be numbered.
It was my mistake that I began too late. If you knew how much I suffer at the thought of the lost years, and that I did not approach my task sooner. If my health were as good as my will, all would be well. But one cannot buy back lost years.
By May, not long after his 44th birthday, his condition had become so critical that his doctors ordered him to a sanitarium in Bohemia. During his stay, he wrote a letter to his wife, with whom he had made peace during the last year.
I know well that I will not find a better one than you, dear, brave mother of my precious children. I wish, dear one, that we were both in better health.
A month later, his doctors transferred him to a clinic in Austria, not far from where he and Julie were married. His wife sat with him day and night. His friend and former nemesis, Hermann Bahr, arrived and took him for walks on the terrace. The Reverend Heckler also came to visit, sitting at his bedside, promising Herzl that he would once again go to Palestine and see Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives. Young Zionists had assembled outside the clinic, standing guard over their leader. Noticing them, he commented,
"They are marvelous, good people, my compatriots. You shall see they shall enter the promised land one day."
The end, when it came on July 3rd, 1904, was sudden. Herzl groaned and his head fell back. He was dead, just 2 months after his 44th birthday. The news of Theodor Herzl's death created a shockwave around the world. Herzl's passing was major news in both mainstream and Jewish newspapers. He was hailed as one of the greatest figures of the century. The Neue Freie Presse, for whom Herzl had toiled for almost 20 years, devoted its front page to an obituary that went into detail about his literary achievements and his work as a foreign correspondent. It reduced his Zionist activities to just 2 small sentences at the end. Tens of thousands of letters and telegrams expressing condolences arrived at his home and office. Chaim Weizmann, who less than a year earlier was criticizing Herzl from the podium at the Zionist Congress, wrote to his wife, Vera, about what the loss meant to him.
At this moment, all the differences between us have disappeared, and I only have the image of a great creative worker in front of my eyes.
And in the shtetl of Plonsk, an 18-year-old David Gruen, who would soon leave for Palestine, was grief-stricken but resolute at the same time.
What a loss. Nevertheless, today, more than ever, I believe we shall succeed. I know the day will come, it is not far, when we will return to the wonderful land.
Thousands converged upon Vienna for the funeral. It was one of the biggest the city had ever seen. Herzl had written that he wanted a poor man's ceremony. No flowers or speeches. But that was not to be the case. Some 6,000 people walked behind the hearse. The funeral services lasted for several hours. Herzl's 13-year-old son Hans read the Kaddish, the Jewish memorial prayer, at his open grave. The Zionist leader asked to be buried next to his father until the day when the Jewish people transfer my remains to Palestine. Theodor Herzl's request was finally carried out on August 16, 1949. His remains were taken from Vienna's Döbling cemetery and flown not to Palestine, but to the State of Israel, declared on May 14, 1948. A little more than 50 years after the Zionist leader's prediction, in the diary entry he wrote upon concluding the First Zionist Congress. Signing the executive order for the transfer and reburial of the remains on the newly named Mount Herzl was David Ben-Gurion, formerly known as David Gruen. The little boy from Plonsk had become Israel's first prime minister. Also officiating at the ceremony was the former chemist and Russian Zionist leader Chaim Weizmann. He'd become Israel's first president. Much had happened in the 4.5 decades since Herzl's untimely passing. Tragedy had struck his family as his wife died in 1907, his mother in 1911, and 2 of his children and his only grandchild were lost to suicide in 1930, 1931, and 1946. His youngest child, Trudi, was murdered by the Nazis in Terezin during the Holocaust. In 1917, the Zionist movement's former lawyer in Great Britain, Prime Minister David Lloyd George, approved the Balfour Declaration. It called for the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine, for which the British were given a League of Nations mandate after World War I in 1919. But bowing to pressure from the Arab world, the British never fulfilled their promise to create a Jewish national home and placed strict limits on the amount of Jews allowed to immigrate to Palestine. Many would later ask, would 6 million European Jewish men, women, and children who perished during the Shoah, which Herzl had long feared, been saved had the doors to Palestine been opened?
The great Jewish people that were living in the diaspora began to justify the diaspora. And Herzl says no. They didn't like the idea. It wasn't only religious. The problem is that the diaspora created a diaspora spirit, if one can say so. And Herzl says no. You can be kings, you can be independent, you can have your own state. Since the Holocaust, they looked upon Israel as a shelter, as a place where the Jewish people can feel safer. Time has come now to look upon Israel not as a shelter, but as a magnet. And there are great things in Israel. A land without water, without territory, without any natural resources, becomes such a great success in agriculture. We are a superpower in high-tech. And this country every day is changing for the better. Jews without miracles would never be a miracle. So Herzl is one of the miracles. And he was the carrier of the dream.
When the prophet Jeremiah was imprisoned for having prophesied the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians and the fall of the city had begun, a vision came to him that he would be approached by a relative to buy land there, and that he should immediately agree. In the vision, the God of Israel promised him houses, fields, and vineyards will yet be bought in this land. There will again be heard in this place, in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem, the sound of joy, the sound of gladness, the sound of the groom and the sound of the bride will again be heard in this place. In those days I will administer justice and righteousness in the land. At the end of the Jewish state, Theodor Herzl envisioned what his dream would bring not only to the Jewish people, but to the world.
What glory awaits those who fight unselfishly for the cause. I believe that a wondrous generation of Jews will spring into existence. We shall live as free men on our own soil and die peacefully in our own homes. And whatever we attempt to accomplish for our own welfare will react powerfully and beneficially for the good of humanity. The world will be freed by our liberty, enriched by our wealth, magnified by our greatness.